Welcome to the show. My guest is Paul Battaglia, the Vice President of Federal Sales for BlackBerry. Paul, welcome to the program.
Good afternoon, Jason.
Let me set some context for our discussion. There are two companion bills currently making their way through Congress that require agencies to take a mobile-first approach to services. The 21st Century Integrated Digital Experience Act, or 21st Century IDEA Act, was introduced in the House by Congressman Ro Khanna and in the Senate by Senator Ron Johnson. Among the provisions in the bill is one that would require agencies to make public an online, mobile-friendly digital service option for any in-person government transaction or paper-based process in a manner that decreases costs, increases digital conversation, and improves customer experience within 2 years of the bill becoming law. Now, these bills build on a growing expectation and realization that agencies still are playing catch-up with the private sector around mobile service options. But it's not just transactional services that need help. Agencies are increasingly using connected devices, whether sensors on buildings to measure energy use or tablets in the field to collect data from citizens. The Trump administration's IT modernization effort hinges on moving services to the citizen and using the data to make better decisions. And at the same time, securing these devices and the data has become more critical. In fact, the Homeland Security Department is adding a mobile security piece to its Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigation, or CDM, program under Phase 3. The capabilities would give agencies visibility from the mobility device management systems by sending data to their agency-wide cyber dashboards. They'll have greater understanding of what's on and which mobile devices are in danger. DHS says it will initially focus on protecting the device and then move to protecting the application and eventually the entire mobile environment. But there's more to securing mobile devices than just CDM and its dashboard. And in fact, that's a good time to turn to our guest. Paul Battaglia is the Vice President of Federal Sales for BlackBerry. Paul, let's just start maybe at the beginning and talk a little bit about security and this, if you will, the state of cybersecurity, maybe as it relates to mobility.
Sure. Good afternoon, Jason. Nice to be with you again. First of all, let me put it in context that I am the Vice President of BlackBerry Federal, but we are talking today in the context of software as a cyber defense, not phones as most people are familiarized with in terms of BlackBerry. But in perspective, just during this day, the government is going to have an estimated 10 million hack attempts, and that's at the Pentagon alone. And you're probably familiar with Thomas Friedman's phrase, "the world is flat," alluding to the connected world. He was referring, of course, to commerce, but it also flattens warfare. And cyber is now warfare, and dozens of countries now currently have or are developing offensive cyber attack capabilities, which is now viewed as the fifth element of warfare after space, sea, land, and air. So the issue for us in terms of defending against this is that no chain is stronger than its weakest link. Mobility happens to be the new frontier for rogue actors, hackers, and adversaries alike. So we have many challenges in front of us. When you talk about the context of that many attempts on our infrastructure daily, the government is big. You talk about reform, congressional reform, but we have slow acquisition processes and very quick to change tools to defend in the war against cyber warfare. So this is a major challenge for our cyber teams. You can't protect against every threat, but I do have to say that our CIOs, our security officers, our cyber teams do an incredible job, and it's a job that's tougher than ever. It's a thankless job. Our experts can't talk about their successes, but one single failure out of those 10 million today will end up on the front page of the newspaper.
It's that idea in many ways of proving that something didn't happen. I know that's oftentimes we talk about that in the cyber world is, okay, how do you prove your worth? Well, you didn't get attacked this week. Well, so what? What'd you do about that? I think that plays into this type of discussion that we're having.
Indeed, good news is no news in the cyber atmosphere, and so the issue we have is we have more and more devices getting connected. However, I think it's Gartner estimates now that there are 8 billion devices connected around the world. There'll be 3 times that many over the next 3 to 4 years. And how do we defend against those? It's mobile devices, it's tablets, but it's also things such as air conditioning units, all being connected in government buildings that are connected to our major networks. So our cyber teams have a major challenge ahead of them. They have to be alert as to whether some virus or threat exists in one application on a single phone while simultaneously defending against other ports into firewalls. So it's a very, very big job, very daunting, but it is the new warfare. Future wars are going to be less about military hardware and more about knocking out information bases or capturing information.
So you're setting us up to be very depressed, by the way. It's all about cyber warfare, the hackers. That's where I wanted to get us to. So the state of cybersecurity is everything is really scary, but there's hope. So what is our hope? Give us Obi-Wan. Tell us the hope.
Well, let's start with all of this in the context of mobility. So mobility, of course, presents an unprecedented opportunity with also unprecedented risk. Phones are portable. They're subject to loss or theft. They store a lot of information these days, right? They're really storage devices, which makes them attractive targets to adversaries, countries, terrorists, organized crime, independent hackers, who are now targeting it with malware to compromise the phone. So take an example. You may have a member of Congress who travels overseas as a part of a congressional delegation. Inevitably, a phone gets left in a cab, in a restaurant, on an airplane. That phone possesses all kinds of information. Could be someone from the Intelligence Committee. So this is what keeps security officers up at night, is these kinds of scenarios.
One thing you bring up here, and I think it's a really interesting example around the congressman or the senator or even just you going to a foreign country and leaving your phone, is we think passwords enough. And we also don't think about our phones as something that is being attacked these days. We think our laptops and our desktops. If you think about all the security we've added to those devices over the last few years, the phone, we don't add as much. So maybe talk a little bit about what you're seeing in that respect around, for instance, why the mobile device now is the if you will, the path of least resistance for hackers in some ways.
Yeah, recent data is showing that attacks on mobile devices is going up 20% each year, and that's commensurate with the growth of mobile devices. You talk about in the government, millions of portable devices like this, mobile phones and tablets. But as an example, take last year, we had something called the crack virus that was attacking mobile phones, and in particular Apple phones, iOS-based handsets. And this did not target the hardware on a phone so much, Jason, as it went after the information, the contacts on a phone. Any kind of data on the phone became vulnerable. And you had a military organization, one of our uniformed agencies, in this case the Air Force, happened to protect against something like this by use of containerized technology on the phone. And I'll talk a little bit further about this later on. But they estimated if they had not protected their phones, over 22,000 mobile phones in the hands of Air Force leadership could have been compromised.
I think that's a great example. It's very similar to the one we hear about, for instance, the WannaCry virus with the desktops. If agencies hadn't moved off Windows 7 or 8 or whatever they were up to back then, and they would have not closed that patching hole. The other piece of this is not just the phone, or as your example, but also the connected devices, more and more connected devices, whether it's sensors for that the NOAA National Weather Service are using, or CBP is using on the border, or even just GSA using it on the buildings to measure heat and air conditioning, electricity usage. How are those also the very becoming more vulnerable?
Well, first of all, if we analyze just the hardware that's being used for mobile phones, these are consumer grade devices, right? We're all used to these. We love them. We're addicted to them, but they're not government grade security. So when we talk about vulnerabilities on these, there has to be extra layers when we're talking about national security at stake. Again, with attacks up 20% a year, more spyware attacking these phones and seeking out information off these phones, they inherently become more vulnerable. You have, for example, if I were the CEO of, let's talk about a private sector example, if I were the CEO of a bank and I have 100,000 employees all accessing my network through their mobile phones. Some bring their own to work, some might be issued by the bank. All it's going to take is one rogue application to tunnel in through that phone and perhaps access the network and compromise the security of the bank, right? In government, it's the same thing. We talk about our defense systems. You talk about sensors being out there. And we had one very odd example where a casino outside of government, a casino was hacked into through the aquarium. So there's nothing that's not being connected these days. We've had Fortune 500s attacked through air conditioning systems. Our government faces the same vulnerabilities as we connect.
And I think that's something that realization is starting to come really to the forefront, that you're, as you said in the beginning, yes, you're only as strong as your weakest link, but that weakest link is more and more becoming, if you will, the tablets, the smartphones, the connected devices. Why do you think that realization is happening? It's not just because IT modernization. It's not just because we all have a phone. We've all had a phone for a decade. Where do you think that did something happen, or just it's an evolution of education among the senior leaders?
This is somewhat a little of both. We are, as we have had our own catastrophic attacks. We all know about the OPM attack from a few years ago, attacks on the VA and other installations. We are simply scared to death about major attacks on the infrastructure, be it our defense infrastructure, our energy infrastructure. Those are things that are now vulnerable because we're creating these tools for not only communication, but really unprecedented work collaboration and productivity. But, last year DHS put out a report that said mobile devices extend enterprise borders outside the physical walls, fences, guards, and firewalls that previously protected the enterprise against physical attacks. Additionally, they have full range of sensors not seen in previous computing devices, which enable new types of attacks on these devices as well as systems they touch. Further, this means that they share many of the same security threats as traditional desktop and laptop computers, and they're also exposed to more threats brought about by their mobility, complexity, and those additional sensors such as GPS.
And I remember the DHS report when it came out, and I think that one of the things that was highlighted in that was this, if you will, broader concern about the connections. We're going to talk in the next segment in a minute about what to do about it, so we're not just scaring people. But can you give me a sense of if you're an agency and you're worried about all these different connected devices, is there one type of device or one, I don't mean a brand, obviously, but should I be most worried about tablets, most worried about smartphones? Should I be most worried about these Internet of Things devices?
I'm going to touch on it in the next segment, but I believe that success can be achieved through a combination of both technology, but also policy. So it's less about hardware and more about policy enforcement, as well as using, of course, the best off-the-shelf encryption and tools that we have available.
All right. You just gave us a great time to take a break and segue us into the next segment. You're listening to the discussion Innovation in Government, sponsored by Carasoft on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM.